Fighting the witch's curse. One woman's struggle for control. Hook. What if the curse you've been running from is the power you've been seeking all along? Isla thought she could escape the darkness, but the truth was far darker than she ever imagined. Is she in control, or has she become a puppet to an ancient, unrelenting force? Stay tuned as the battle between light and shadow reaches its shocking climax, and Isla uncovers the terrifying truth about her fate. You won't believe what happens next. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the forest. The trees seemed to sway without a breeze. A feeling of unease settled in the air. Isla walked deeper into the woods, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The path was narrow, barely visible beneath the blanket of snow. Every step felt heavier. The wind whispered through the branches, like voices just out of reach. Her breath formed clouds in the icy air. The silence around her pressed in, suffocating. She was close. She could feel it. A shiver ran down her spine. Ahead, she saw the faint outline of a cottage, its windows dark. The door creaked open without a sound. She hesitated, but something pulled her forward. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with dust and decay. The scent of something rotten lingered in the corners. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive. In the center of the room, a black cauldron bubbled softly. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden floor beneath her feet. Isla stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, touching the surface of the cauldron. Suddenly, the room grew colder, the temperature dropping in an instant. She recoiled, but it was too late. A voice, raspy and ancient, filled her ears. "Why have you come?" The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching for her. Her legs froze in place. A figure appeared in the doorway, hunched and cloaked in tattered black robes. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure rasped, its voice sending chills through her bones. The door slammed shut behind her. Isla turned, panic flooding her chest. The figure took a step forward, its presence crushing the air. The room grew darker, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. "You're too late," the witch whispered. Isla tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. A sharp pain erupted in her chest. Her hands moved to her heart, but she couldn't stop it. The witch laughed softly, a sound that echoed in her mind. The cauldron's bubbling grew louder, and Isla could feel the curse taking hold. The pain in her chest intensified, spreading through her limbs like wildfire. Her vision blurred, the room spinning around her. The witch's laugh grew louder, filling the space with an unbearable, mocking tone. Isla's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably. She tried to move, to escape, but her legs felt like lead. The shadows around her twisted, pressing in, suffocating her. The witch took another step forward, its eyes never leaving hers. "You thought you could break the curse," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Isla's mind was clouded, but a single thought cut through the fog. The cauldron. She had to stop it. With what little strength she had left, Isla forced her feet to move. Her body screamed in protest as she stumbled toward the cauldron. The witch's figure loomed behind her, its presence overwhelming. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the boiling liquid. Suddenly, the cauldron froze, its surface turning black as night. A coldness gripped Isla's bones, stealing the warmth from her body. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, and the shadows seemed to stir. The witch was gone. In her place stood something far worse. A figure, tall and twisted, its face a grotesque mask of anguish and rage. It moved toward Isla, its eyes burning with an unnatural fury. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat a countdown to her demise. But then, something shifted. The floor beneath her feet cracked open, a deep, rumbling sound filling the air. Isla looked down, the earth splitting wide, swallowing the shadows whole. The witch's curse was not just a spell. It was a trap. The ground trembled violently, throwing her off balance. She fell, her body crashing into the darkness below. The last thing she heard was the witch's voice, distorted and furious. "You will never escape." Then, silenced, Isla's body tumbled through the darkness, weightless and disoriented. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, like it was alive. A cold, damp air brushed against her skin, as if she had fallen into some forgotten pit. Her hands scraped against rough stone as she reached out for anything to hold onto. But there was nothing. The shadows closed in around her, thick and suffocating. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, panic rising in her chest. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet solidified with a sickening crack. She hit the floor hard, her body slamming into jagged rocks. Pain shot through her, but she couldn't focus on it. The silence was deafening. A faint glow flickered ahead. She forced herself to move, crawling toward the light, her fingers raw against the cold stone. The glow grew stronger as she got closer, revealing a small, narrow tunnel. It led to something. Hope surged through her, but it was quickly swallowed by dread. The closer she got, the colder it became, and the air tasted foul, like rotten earth. Isla reached the entrance and hesitated, staring into the dark void beyond. She could hear something, faint whispers like voices calling her name. The ground shook again, a tremor that rattled her bones. A chill ran down her spine. She turned back for a moment, only to find the shadows creeping toward her. The tunnel was her only chance. Isla stepped inside, her feet unsteady, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the shadows were alive, aware of her. She stumbled forward, the tunnel narrowing with each step. The glow ahead flickered and then disappeared. Total darkness swallowed her. Then, a soft sound like a whisper right in her ear. She froze. "Welcome," the voice said. It was the witch, and she was right behind her. Isla's breath caught in her throat. The voice was close, too close. She could feel the heat of its presence against her back. Frozen, her body trembled uncontrollably. A low, mocking laugh filled the air, swirling around her. "You can't escape me," the witch's voice whispered. Isla's pulse thundered in her ears as she spun around, her eyes straining to see through the thick darkness. Nothing. No figure. No shape. Just the suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. A sudden chill ran through her, as if the air itself had turned to ice. She took a step back, then another. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the tunnel was shifting. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder, angrier. Her heart pounded, and panic surged. "Leave me alone," she screamed into the void. But the witch only laughed again, cruel and triumphant. The darkness seemed to pulse, closing in tighter around her. Isla's breath came in ragged gasps. Her limbs felt like they were sinking into the earth, heavy and slow. She stumbled, nearly falling to her knees. But then a flicker, a light, small and distant. It flickered and disappeared, flickered again. A way out. Without thinking, Isla rushed toward it. Her hands reached out, grasping for anything, her legs moving faster than she could control. The tunnel seemed to stretch, the distance between her and the light growing longer. The whispers grew frantic, the shadows clinging to her. She could almost feel the witch's fingers brush her neck. The air thickened with a dark energy, a suffocating weight that pressed against her chest. But the light, it was so close. Desperation surged through her, and she ran, her feet pounding against the ground. A flash of movement, Something darted just ahead, blocking her path. Isla skidded to a halt, her heart racing. There, in the dim glow, stood the witch. Her eyes gleamed with malicious delight. "You thought you could outrun me," the witch hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Isla's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her hands shaking. The witch raised her arms, and the shadows swirled around her, swirling like a storm. Isla turned and ran. The tunnel behind her seemed to twist, changing shape, as if it too were alive. The light grew brighter, pulling her forward. But the witch was relentless. Her laughter echoed, growing louder and louder. The end of the tunnel was in sight now. Isla pushed herself harder, every muscle in her body screaming in agony. She could almost reach it. Just a few more steps, and then nothing. The ground beneath her feet cracked open again, and the floor vanished. She fell. Isla plummeted into the abyss, her body weightless as the darkness swallowed her whole. The cold air whipped past her, and for a moment she felt suspended, lost in time. Her stomach lurched, and her scream was lost in the endless fall. The world around her twisted, shapes flickering in and out of sight, nothing solid or real. Suddenly, the fall ended with a violent jolt. Her body crashed into something soft, but it wasn't the ground. It was wet. Isla gasped for breath, her chest heaving, and she forced her eyes open. She was in a cavern, damp and suffocating. A thick fog clung to the air, swirling lazily around her. Her skin felt clammy, cold from the moisture in the air. The ground beneath her was spongy, and the smell of rot filled her nostrils. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky. The darkness pressed against her again, thick and suffocating. Something was wrong. It was too quiet, too still. Then a movement. A figure, barely visible in the gloom, slowly emerged from the shadows. Isla froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure took a step forward. The light, dim as it was, revealed something hideous. A face, contorted with agony, pale as death. Its eyes were wide, empty sockets staring straight at her. A low, guttural groan filled the cavern. The figure was not human. It was something older, twisted by the curse. The shadows around it seemed to reach, stretching like hands, pulling at the air. Isla's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Isla's mind raced. Was this the witch's doing? Had she fallen into some dark realm of torment? The figure raised its arms, fingers crooked and sharp. A soft hiss echoed from its throat, a sound that sent ice through Isla's veins. It took another step toward her. The ground trembled beneath her feet. The shadows closed in faster, pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Her eyes flicked around wildly, searching for any escape, and then she saw it. A narrow passageway at the far end of the cavern. The figure was still coming, its eyes locked on hers, hungry and relentless. Isla's heart raced. She had to move. She had to get away. With every ounce of strength she had left, she forced herself to run. Her feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted toward the narrow passage. The figure behind her moved with unnatural speed, its distorted form a blur in her peripheral vision. Isla's breath was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest like it would burst. The passage was closer now, but the shadows around her thickened, crawling along the walls, trying to pull her back. She reached the entrance, her fingers grasping the jagged stone of the tunnel's mouth. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, clawing at her mind, urging her to stop. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let that thing catch her. With a final burst of strength, Isla lunged forward into the passageway. The tunnel was tight, its walls pressing in on her as she squeezed through, her shoulders scraping against the rough stone. The figure was still behind her, its presence like a dark storm closing in, but she didn't dare look back. Her only focus was the end of the tunnel. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and mold. The passage seemed endless, each step feeling like an eternity. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep moving. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of her own breathing deafening in her ears. Then, just as she thought she could go no further, a faint light appeared ahead. Hope sparked in her chest. The end. Isla stumbled forward, her movements desperate. The light grew brighter, clearer. She was almost there. But just as her hand reached out toward the light, the ground beneath her feet shifted again. The tunnel began to crack, splitting open like a gaping wound. Isla fell to her knees, the passage buckling and collapsing around her. The walls trembled violently, and the floor beneath her gave way. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Her body was pulled down faster than she could react. The light flickered once, then disappeared. And then the world went black. Isla's body fell into the void, tumbling, spinning, and crashing against something hard. Pain exploded in her chest, and her breath caught in a strangled gasp. She opened her eyes, but saw nothing, just an endless expanse of blackness. Her mind felt like it was shattering, the edges of reality bending in on itself. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, almost paralyzed. The silence around her was suffocating, and the air tasted thick, like it was soaked in something foul. And then, far in the distance, a faint light. It flickered once, twice, then it steadied. Isla's heart skipped. She tried to push herself up, but her body refused to obey. The light was still there, flickering like a distant star. Slowly, agonizingly, she dragged her body toward it, one agonizing inch at a time. The ground beneath her felt uneven, soft and spongy. Every movement took all her will, and her chest ached with each breath she managed to take. The light grew stronger, clearer. She could make out the outline of something. Stone walls, ancient and covered in moss. A room. Isla forced her legs to move, dragging herself through the thick air toward it. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder, rushing toward her like a torrent of voices. "You will never leave," they hissed, a chorus of sorrow and rage. The shadows around her twisted, pulling at her, but she fought against them. Closer, closer. Finally, her trembling hand reached out and touched the stone doorway. The moment her fingers made contact, the light exploded around her, blinding, and then the world shifted again. She was no longer in the cavern, no longer trapped by the shadows. The room she found herself in was different, strange and alien, filled with flickering torches that cast eerie shadows on the walls. A large, dark stone altar stood at the center, surrounded by ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time. And there, standing before the altar, was the witch. But she was not the same as before. Her form was twisted, her skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame, her eyes hollow voids. "You should not have come," the witch whispered, her voice hollow and chilling. Isla's heart clenched in fear. There was no escape now. The curse had claimed her. Isla's pulse thundered in her ears, her body trembling with dread. The witch's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment there was silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then the witch's lips curled into a cruel smile, as if savoring Isla's fear. "You thought you could defy me," she murmured, her voice a dry rasp that scraped against the walls of Isla's mind. Isla's mind spun, her breath shallow and frantic. There had to be a way out. She couldn't just give up now. Her legs wobbled, but she pushed herself to stand, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the cold stone altar. The witch stepped closer, her steps unnervingly slow, deliberate. The air around her crackled with an unnatural energy, the shadows moving of their own accord, writhing like living things. "You are mine," the witch whispered, her voice low and venomous. "Forever." Isla's chest tightened. Her mind raced, trying to find some escape, some way to break free. But the witch was already too close. The oppressive darkness, the weight of the curse, had already begun to close in around her, swallowing every hope, every breath. And then, as if sensing her desperation, the witch lifted her hands, fingers stretched wide like claws. "No," Isla gasped, her voice a choked plea. But it was too late. The witch's hands hovered just above Isla's head, a surge of dark energy crackling from her fingertips. The shadows around them thickened, pressing in tighter, and Isla felt her body go cold numb. Her breath came in panicked gasps, and she felt the life being drained from her, as if the very air was being stolen away. The stone beneath her feet seemed to pulse, and the symbols carved into the walls began to glow with a sickly light. Isla tried to scream, but the sound was choked off, lost in the suffocating darkness. Her limbs began to grow heavy, her vision blurring. The witch's voice echoed through her mind, distorted and maddening. "You cannot escape what you have awakened," she hissed, her words like nails on a chalkboard. "You will be my vessel. My curse is eternal." Isla's vision wavered, the room spinning, the shadows closing in tighter and tighter. Her last thought, as her body froze, her breath slowing, was that the witch had won. The curse was complete, but just as the darkness began to claim her entirely, a sudden flash of light pierced through the suffocating gloom. It was a sharp, blinding beam that cut through the shadows, searing into Isla's mind like a blade. The witch recoiled, her face contorting in anger and confusion. "No," she hissed, raising her arms to shield herself from the light. Isla's body felt weightless, as if the curse was losing its grip, just for a moment. She forced her eyes open, the light now burning through the air, filling her vision with white-hot intensity. The altar beneath her began to crack, the symbols on the walls pulsing, as if the very foundations of the room were breaking apart. The witch staggered back, her form flickering, as if the light was slowly unraveling her very existence. "No!" the witch screamed, her voice filled with rage and terror. Isla, trembling, forced herself to move, her legs unsteady beneath her. With a final burst of strength, she took a step forward, her hand reaching for the light, her fingers brushing the air around her. The room trembled again, the cracks widening, and the shadows recoiled, writhing and shrieking. The light flared once more, blinding in its brilliance, and the witch let out a final, inhuman scream. Everything went silent. The light dimmed, and Isla collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. She opened her eyes, blinking against the aftereffects of the blinding light. The room had changed. The walls, once dark and oppressive, were now silent and empty, no longer suffused with the weight of the curse. The altar was shattered, pieces of stone scattered across the floor. The shadows had vanished, and the witch gone. Isla's breath was still ragged, but the pressure on her chest had lifted. She was free, but as she rose unsteadily to her feet, the faintest whisper echoed in the back of her mind. "You can never truly escape." It was soft, a lingering voice that dripped with malice. Isla froze, her heart lurching. She spun around, but the room was empty, silent. A deep, unsettling stillness filled the air. The curse had been broken, hadn't it? Her legs trembled as she took a step forward, unsure of where to go or what to believe. The darkness had not entirely released its grip, and deep within her chest, she could feel it, the faintest, chilling pulse. The curse was never fully gone. It lingered, waiting. Isla didn't know if she had escaped the witch's grasp, or if the true horror was still to come that Isla's breath caught in her throat as the chilling pulse in her chest grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a faint sensation, like the shadow of a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. But it wasn't just her body that felt different. The air around her seemed to change too, thicker, colder. A low hum, almost imperceptible, filled the room. Her pulse quickened. She looked around, her eyes darting from one corner of the shattered chamber to the next, searching for something, anything, that might explain the sudden shift. The light that had once burned so brightly now flickered, as if struggling to hold on to its existence. The whispering voice returned, more distinct now, echoing in her mind like a warning. You thought you could break it, but it is already inside you. Isla's legs trembled as she took a step backward, the feeling of being watched creeping over her. She could feel the curse, an invisible force wrapping itself around her heart, squeezing it slowly. Her hands shook, the pulse in her chest like a ticking clock, counting down to something she couldn't escape. The air around her seemed to warp, distorting as though reality itself was bending. For the first time, fear gripped her not because of what she had seen, but because of what she was becoming. Was she truly free, or had the curse already claimed her in a way she couldn't comprehend? Her thoughts raced, trying to find a way out, some way to stop it, but everything felt heavier now, as if the weight of the curse was building, suffocating her from within. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking, and then the temperature dropped, sharp and biting. A figure appeared before her, emerging from the shadows, its outline hazy and indistinct. Isla stumbled back, her breath freezing in her chest. The figure grew clearer, its shape forming slowly, until the last, unmistakable detail emerged. It was the witch, but different, changed. The witch's eyes burned with an unnatural fire, glowing with the remnants of the curse. "You cannot escape me," she rasped, her voice more distant now, yet filled with an eerie certainty. "You are mine." The figure reached out, her long, clawed fingers curling toward Isla's chest, toward the dark pulse that throbbed inside her. Isla's heart raced, a primal fear surging through her. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, held by some unseen force. The witch's smile twisted into something hideous. "You can never outrun your own darkness," she whispered, her voice fading as she reached for Isla. And then, with a violent jolt, the darkness in Isla's chest surged, filling every fiber of her being. Her vision blurred, the room spinning. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows that had once been defeated. The curse hadn't broken. It had only been waiting for her to fall. That Isla's mind exploded with chaos as the dark pulse inside her surged to life, taking control. Her body felt as though it were being torn apart, stretched and twisted by an unseen force. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving with the effort to remain conscious. The witch's figure loomed before her, its shadow stretching longer, swallowing the room, consuming everything. "You are mine," the witch whispered again, the words reverberating in Isla's skull. Isla's vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening, collapsing inward. Her limbs began to twitch uncontrollably, her muscles locking into unnatural positions, her hands clenching into fists. The light flickered and died. The room was suffocating, the darkness now so thick it felt like it had substance, like it was alive, pressing against her skin, pulling her toward the witch. Her heart pounded, the thumping in her chest like a drumbeat, growing louder, faster, as though time itself was being sped up. And then she felt it, a deep, searing pain, spreading from her chest outward, like a fire consuming her from the inside. It was the curse. It was alive in her now. Isla cried out, but no sound came, her voice smothered by the crushing weight of the darkness. Her body shook, her mind splintering as the curse tore through her veins, feeding on her fear, her pain. But even in the agony, something inside her fought. A flicker of resistance, small but fierce. She couldn't give in, not like this. With every ounce of will she had left, Isla forced herself to take a breath, to pull her mind back from the brink. The witch's form seemed to blur, flickering in and out of existence, a cruel smile twisting across her hollow face. "You cannot resist me," the witch said, her voice thick with dark satisfaction. "You are nothing now but my vessel." But Isla, through the pain, through the cold, clenching fear, felt something shift. The darkness that had threatened to consume her began to tremble. A crack appeared in the wall of shadows surrounding her. The pulse inside her began to waver, to falter. It was the smallest crack, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Isla focused on it. She drew every last shred of strength, every ounce of resistance into that crack, forcing it wider. The shadows hissed in anger, recoiling as the light, faint but growing, began to pour through. "You cannot fight me," the witch screamed, her form growing unstable, shifting with each word. Isla's pulse quickened, not from the curse this time, but from the growing light within her. The darkness began to burn, starting from her chest, the heat of it spreading outwards, pushing back against the witch's grip. The witch screamed in rage, her voice trembling, distorting as the light grew brighter, fiercer. "No," the witch hissed, but it was already too late. The light exploded from Isla's chest, a flash so bright that it burned away the shadows, the curse, the witch herself. And with a final, deafening roar, everything went silent. Isla collapsed, her body limp, her breath ragged. The room was empty now. No witch, no curse. The only sound left was the slow, steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Isla lay there for what felt like an eternity, her mind still reeling, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Had she won? Had she truly broken the curse? But deep inside her, she felt something. A faint, lingering pulse. Not of darkness, but of something else. Something new. Something that had replaced the curse. And this time, it wasn't the witch's. It was hers. Isla lay on the cold stone floor, her body still trembling from the force of the explosion of light. Her breath was shallow, as if the air itself had been changed, now thicker with a strange weight. The lingering pulse inside her felt foreign, yet somehow familiar, like a quiet thrum beneath her ribs, soft, steady, and unyielding. It wasn't the curse. She was certain of that. But it wasn't normal either. Her chest tightened, and she sat up, pushing herself unsteadily to her feet. The room around her seemed altered, distant. The walls were no longer covered in dark symbols. Their glow now faded to an ordinary stone gray. The air felt cleaner, but there was still a heaviness, a suffocating presence that remained just at the edge of her consciousness. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her fingers trembling. Was she free, truly free? Or had something else taken root inside her? Isla took a cautious step forward, her gaze searching the chamber, but there was no sign of the witch. No flickering shadows, no dark force pressing down on her. But that feeling, the pulse, the steady hum inside her, would not let her go. It wasn't a curse anymore, she realized, but something else, something born from her own soul, something born from the witch's twisted magic that she had somehow absorbed. Her heart raced again, not from fear, but from an undeniable sense of power. She didn't understand it, but it was there. Her fingers tingled with an unfamiliar energy as she reached out to touch the stone altar. A flicker of light responded, rippling across the surface, as if the room itself recognized what she was now. Isla gasped and withdrew her hand, the energy crackling around her fingertips. It was hers, this power, but it was unstable, untamed, wild. Suddenly, the air shifted again. A chill ran through her, sharp and cold, and for a split second, the pulse within her faltered, as if something were trying to pull it back into the darkness. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching the room for anything that could explain the sudden shift. From the corner of the chamber, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadow, small at first, creeping slowly along the stone floor toward her. It was alive. The pulse inside her reacted violently, thrumming with anger, with fear. The shadow grew, stretching out, twisting into a form. It was no longer the witch, but something else, something she could not name, and it was coming for her. Isla's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands clenched into fists. The pulse within her surged, no longer a whisper, but a roar. She could feel it, this new force, coursing through her, making her stronger, faster. With a breath, she stepped forward, her mind focused. The shadow writhed, but it hesitated. The energy in her palm crackled, glowing faintly. It stopped. The pulse inside her flickered once again, a quiet, almost peaceful hum. The shadow recoiled. The room grew colder still, but Isla held her ground. The pulse was hers, not just a weapon, but a part of her, and she would learn to control it. She had no other choice. As the shadow trembled, she felt its essence, an echo of the witch, but different now, weaker. Isla clenched her hand into a fist, and with one final surge of will, she pulled the light within her forward. The pulse flared. The shadow screamed, twisting into a writhing mass of darkness, before vanishing into nothingness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. But Isla knew. This wasn't over. The darkness may have been banished for now, but it would always find its way back. And now, she was part of that darkness. Her pulse, her power, would either save or destroy her. Isla stood in the now silent chamber, her breath still heavy in her chest, her hands trembling. The shadows had gone, but the presence of something far darker lingered in the air, like the last whispers of a storm that had just passed. Her body hummed with the power she had taken on, and it frightened her. The shadow, the thing she had just destroyed, had been a part of the witch, or at least it had seemed so. But it felt like something deeper than that, something ancient and twisted. She stepped back, every instinct screaming at her to run, to leave this place before something worse came for her. But where could she run? The curse had already taken root inside her, and no matter where she went, the pulse would follow. Her heart drummed against her chest, and the power within her grew restless, responding to her unease. Was it alive? Could she control it? Isla didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her, a constant presence in the back of her mind. She glanced at the broken altar. The stone pieces lay scattered, remnants of the witch's twisted rituals, and yet there was still a faint warmth to the stone, something waiting. She moved toward the altar, unable to resist the pull. The moment her fingers brushed against it again, the pulse within her flared, a sudden surge of energy. The symbols that had once glowed darkly began to stir, shifting beneath her touch, glowing with a soft, eerie light. She gasped and pulled her hand away, her eyes wide with disbelief. The power inside her had stirred the room itself, like an ancient spell had been triggered. And then a voice that was not her own, a low whisper, filled with shadows, slipped into her mind. "You are not alone." Isla's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't the witch's. It was deeper, more primal, and it radiated from the pulse inside her. For a moment, everything stopped. Her surroundings blurred, and all she could hear was the rhythmic pounding of her heart. The voice was inside her, and yet not. It was in her mind, but it was also around her, filling the empty spaces with a dark, familiar hum. "You've awakened me." Her skin prickled with the weight of the words. Who was speaking to her? What was this thing that had been awakened? She staggered back, her mind racing. A memory surfaced, one from the moment she had first entered the witch's lair. The whispering shadows, the words from the witch's mouth. Asterisk, you will be my vessel. My curse is eternal. Asterisk. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. She hadn't just taken the witch's power. She had absorbed something older, something more dangerous, something that had been trapped inside the witch's magic for centuries. She could feel it now, lurking deep within her, an ancient presence stretching its claws into her very soul. And she understood. The curse wasn't just about the witch. It was about everything she had touched, everything she had taken. The pulse was not just the echo of the witch. It was the dark force that had created her. The dark force that was now alive inside of her. You cannot escape me, the voice whispered again, this time more insistent, almost mocking. Isla's body went cold as the weight of the truth settled over her like a shroud. Her breathing quickened. She had thought she had broken the curse, but it had only evolved. She hadn't just freed herself from the witch's grip. She had become the witch. The pulse inside her grew stronger, a low, rhythmic beat that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Her hands shook as she tried to hold onto herself, tried to fight against the force that was overwhelming her. But it was too late. The darkness had taken root. It was part of her now, and no matter how hard she tried to resist, she could feel it, like a tide rising inside her, just waiting for the moment when it would consume her completely. You belong to me, the voice murmured, its presence coiling around her mind like smoke. Isla closed her eyes, trying to shut it out, but it was futile. She was the darkness now. There was no escaping it. And as the pulse surged again, deeper, stronger, she realized the truth. The curse had never been broken. It had simply begun. Isla was no longer just a victim. She was its vessel. And the witch's legacy would live on. Through her, Isla's chest tightened as the realization settled deeper within her. The pulse in her chest, now louder and more persistent, wasn't something she could escape. The darkness wasn't a distant memory. It was her present, her future. Her hands shook uncontrollably as the shadows in the room seemed to bend toward her, responding to the power now flowing through her veins. She could feel it, the weight of the curse, no longer a whisper in the distance, but a living, breathing entity. The voice, that deep, insistent hum, was no longer just in her mind. It was around her, inside her, every part of her being now tethered to something far darker than she had ever imagined. You are not just the witch's heir, the voice murmured, its tone like the wind before a storm. You are the vessel that will carry her into the world. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had become more than just a victim of the witch's curse. She had become the next phase of the curse itself. Desperation clawed at Isla's insides, and she staggered back from the altar, her feet dragging through the dust-covered floor. She needed to get out, to escape, but she knew now there was nowhere to run. The shadows in the room stretched, curling around her, closing in like a suffocating fog. She felt their cold tendrils creeping over her skin, pulling at her very essence, dragging her toward the altar as if some unseen force was trying to bind her to the stone once more. She gritted her teeth, fighting against the pull. Her pulse raced as she felt the power inside her surge, like a dark tide crashing over her. No, she would not give in. With a primal scream, Isla pushed forward, struggling to break free of the darkness that threatened to overtake her. The room seemed to quake as the pulse inside her flared again, each beat shaking her to her core. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. The shadows recoiled. The pulse inside her began to falter, as if it were confused by her resistance. For a brief, fleeting instant, she felt a strange sense of control. She could feel the darkness, But it wasn't pulling her down, it was waiting, hesitating, as though it didn't know how to proceed without her full surrender. The voice, that haunting whisper, faltered as well. "You think you can fight this?" it hissed, but there was a crack of uncertainty in its words. Isla's heart pounded louder, her every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape the room that had become her prison. But there was one thing she had learned in her time in this cursed place. She wasn't powerless. Not anymore. Her hands clenched into fists, the power in her chest flaring to life as she reached down, pulling from the very depths of herself, drawing every ounce of strength and will she could muster. The shadows around her writhed, the room groaning as if the walls themselves were protesting her resistance. And then, in a sudden rush, the pulse inside her erupted, a violent burst of light that blinded her, filling the room with an energy so powerful that the stone beneath her feet cracked and splintered. The shadows screamed, recoiling from the light, shriveling like paper set aflame. Isla gasped, her body trembling with the force of the surge. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. With one final cry, she thrust her hands forward, releasing the raw energy she had just unearthed. The pulse exploded outward in a wave of light and heat, flooding the room, tearing through the darkness that had once consumed her. The witch's voice screamed in fury, fading as the last of the shadows vanished, torn apart by the blinding force Isla had unleashed. And then everything went still. Isla's chest heaved as she collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The pulse inside her still throbbed, but it was no longer the suffocating weight it had been. It was still there, deep within her, but now it felt different, controlled, subdued. She had fought it. She had won. But as the room fell silent, a chilling thought lingered in her mind. The curse had not been destroyed. It had been subdued. The darkness was still inside her. But now, she was the one in control. That Isla's breath steadied as she sat in the center of the room, the remnants of the curse still lingering in the air around her, but no longer suffocating her. The shadows had receded, leaving behind a hollow silence, a stillness that pressed against her ears like a heavy fog. Her hands trembled, but not from fear anymore. The power inside her was no longer an uncontrollable force. It was a part of her. She could feel it, pulsing quietly beneath her skin, waiting, patient. But the knowledge of what she had become, a vessel of darkness and light intertwined, gnawed at her. Was she truly in control? Or was she only deluding herself, waiting for the moment when the curse would surge back, stronger than before? She stood slowly, her muscles stiff, her body still weary from the battle she had fought within herself. The room around her seemed lifeless. The shattered altar, the broken walls, the air still thick with the echoes of the witch's magic. All of it seemed to shrink in comparison to the force now surging through Isla. Her heart still raced, and the pulse within her throbbed. It wasn't just power, it was awareness. A dark awareness that whispered through her thoughts, pressing against her mind like an unwanted shadow. You are not free. The voice returned, this time distant but insistent, like a creeping fog that refused to dissipate. Isla closed her eyes, shaking her head. No, she couldn't listen to it. She wouldn't. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had become something more than human, more than a simple victim of the witch's curse. She had transformed, and now the darkness lived inside her, forever intertwined with her soul. She walked to the center of the room, her feet barely making a sound against the cold stone floor. The symbols on the walls, once glowing with malice, had faded to nothing more than faint scars in the rock. But there was still a deep, lingering feeling in the air, a remnant of the magic, a thread that refused to be severed. Isla lifted her hand, feeling the power inside her hum, like a string being plucked. The faintest tendril of shadow danced at her fingertips, and she clenched her fist, willing it away. She couldn't afford to let it control her again. But even as she tried to suppress it, she felt the shadows stirring, pushing at her control. She wasn't alone in this body anymore. The realization came like a sudden wave of cold. The curse hadn't vanished. It had merely settled, waiting for its moment. But this time, it wasn't the witch's will she was carrying. It was her own. She had to be the one to shape it, to control it. The power was hers, not the witch's. Her pulse quickened. She had to find a way to make this work, to live with the darkness inside her without letting it destroy her. Isla turned, walking towards the door that led outside, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She was free, yes, but at what cost? Would she ever be able to rid herself of this power, or had it already claimed her body and soul? The doorway loomed before her, the world beyond beckoning. She took one final glance at the room, at the place where the witch's curse had almost destroyed her. But she had survived, and now it was time to face what came next. The pulse inside her flared once more, and she paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. She could feel the pull. The darkness was always there, but now it was part of her, like an extension of her very being. She wasn't sure how long she could keep it at bay, but as the door creaked open, the first light of dawn spilling through the cracks, she knew one thing for certain. The real battle was only just beginning, and she would fight it with everything she had. The first rays of dawn spilled through the door, bathing Isla in a soft, golden light. For a moment, she stood frozen in place, feeling the warmth on her skin, the promise of a new day. But it didn't feel like a new beginning, not for her. The pulse inside her shifted, a low hum that seemed to sync with her heartbeat, a constant reminder of what she had become. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the air tasted different, thicker, almost oppressive. She stepped outside. The world was quiet, the forest surrounding the ruined structure still as death, the trees casting long shadows on the ground as the morning sun tried to break through the branches. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was unsettling. Every step she took, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, clinging to her like old memories. The darkness inside her stirred, and she could feel its weight, pressing at the edges of her thoughts. Isla tried to push it down, to ignore it, but she knew it wasn't something that could be simply forgotten. She was carrying it with her now, an invisible burden that would follow her wherever she went. As she moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched crept over her, a presence she couldn't shake, an unsettling sensation that made her skin crawl. She wasn't alone. The thought gnawed at her as she quickened her pace, her footsteps soft but purposeful against the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in around her, their dark trunks bending inward, as if they were closing her off from the world outside. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A figure, standing still in the shadows, between the trees. Isla's heart skipped a beat, her body tensing. She froze. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze on her, sharp and unyielding. She didn't recognize it, but something about it felt familiar. A coldness in the air, a sense of foreboding that twisted her gut. And then the voice came. Not the witch's this time. A different voice. "You are not free, Isla." The words cut through the air, slicing through the stillness, and Isla's breath caught in her throat. The voice was smooth, yet layered with something ancient, something terrifying. The figure stepped forward, its form emerging from the shadows with unnatural grace. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, the edges of its body flickering like smoke. For a moment, Isla couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The pulse inside her responded, flaring in response to the presence, a deep, instinctual fear rising up within her. The figure stopped just in front of her, its face obscured, but she could feel its eyes boring into her soul. "You think you've conquered the curse, Isla," it continued, its voice soft but filled with a cruel amusement. But the curse is not something you can escape. It is not something you can control. It owns you. Isla's throat tightened, the pulse inside her now searing, like a flame that refused to be extinguished. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her mouth, strangled by the weight of the presence before her. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it could sense her internal struggle. You are no longer human. You never were, not fully. You were always meant to become one of us, a harbinger of the darkness. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows around them seemed to grow, twisting and swirling, as if coming to life. Isla took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself was holding her there. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am not like you. I'm not." The figure let out a low chuckle, cutting her off. "Do you think this is a choice? You were always meant to be part of this. The witch's curse was never about her. It was about you. You were the vessel, and now you are the vessel of something far worse." Isla's body shook as the shadows wrapped tighter around her, the pulse in her chest pulsing harder, almost suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, and Isla could feel the power it carried, dark and oppressive. It wasn't just a person. It was something else, something ancient. "Accept it," the figure murmured, its voice like ice sliding down her spine. "You are the curse now. There is no escaping what you have become." For the briefest of moments, Isla felt herself slipping. The darkness inside her surged in response to the figure's words, pushing her, urging her to give in, to embrace what she had become. But then, in the depth of her fear, something else stirred. The light that had once come from within her, the light that had driven back the witch's power, began to flicker in the pit of her chest. Faint at first, but it was there, growing stronger. She clenched her fists, the light igniting in response to her defiance. It fought back against the shadows that tried to smother it. "I will not become what you want," Isla said, her voice trembling but determined. The figure's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only hunger. "You already have, Isla. You already have." Isla's pulse hammered in her chest as the figure's words settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She could feel the shadows tightening around her, cold fingers of darkness brushing against her skin, trying to pull her down, to drag her into the same endless void that had swallowed the witch. But there, within her, the light, faint, fragile, pulsed with quiet defiance. She clung to it. She wasn't just the vessel, not just the curse. She had the power to choose. The figure moved closer, the shadows swirling around its feet, forming tendrils that reached toward her. It was all-consuming, but Isla stood her ground, her eyes narrowing with newfound resolve. "You don't understand," the figure whispered, its voice cold, yet thick with venom. "You can never escape this. Darkness has claimed you. You are the darkness now." The shadows pulsed around her, wrapping tighter, pulling her closer. But Isla's breath came quicker, her body tensing in resistance. She could feel the weight of their cold pressure pressing against her chest. But in the same breath, she felt the warmth of the light deep within her, stirring. She closed her eyes, focusing, feeling the pulse inside her shift, growing stronger, brighter. It wasn't just the power of the curse anymore. It was hers, her will, her strength, her light. "Maybe," she said, her voice low and steady, "I was meant to carry the curse. But that doesn't mean I have to surrender to it." The figure paused, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in its darkened gaze. For a moment, the shadows seemed to falter, shrinking back, just a fraction. "Do not be a fool," it warned, but the edge in its voice was softer now. "You cannot win this fight." Isla took a deep breath, her eyes still closed, her hands shaking at her sides. She could feel the presence of the curse in her chest, a dark weight, but it was no longer just a force pushing against her. Now, it was like a storm waiting to be unleashed, a power she could shape. The light inside her flared, a sudden burst of warmth and clarity. She snapped her eyes open, and the room around her seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled, skittering away from the intense glow emanating from her. "I'm not a fool," she said, her voice steady as she raised her hands, feeling the pulse swell within her. "But you don't know me." With a snap of her fingers, a burst of light shot forward, cutting through the swirling darkness. The air crackled as the pulse within her exploded outward, sending a shockwave that shattered the shadows, scattering them like leaves in a storm. The figure staggered back, its form flickering, momentarily unstable. The light surged in her chest, stronger now, as if she were drawing power from some deep, untapped reservoir within herself. The figure's voice hissed through the chaos. "You cannot banish us, Isla. We are in your blood. You are ours." But Isla didn't flinch. She felt the weight of its words, felt the presence of darkness trying to pull at her again, but she didn't allow it to take root. "I am my own," she whispered, the words vibrating through the air. The pulse within her surged again, the light bursting forth in waves, washing over the figure. The shadows writhed, shrieking in agony, recoiling as if burned by her light. The figure's form twisted and flickered, slowly unraveling under the force of her power. "You're wrong," Isla said, as she focused everything on her hands, shaping the light, pulling it to the surface. "I am no one's vessel. I am mine." With one final burst, the light exploded outward, engulfing the figure in a blinding flare. For a moment, the world was consumed by light. The air was thick with energy, crackling with the power Isla had harnessed. And then, silence. The darkness was gone. Isla stood alone in the clearing, the echoes of the battle still rippling through her veins. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her hands still glowing faintly, the light slowly dimming as she regained control. The pulse inside her, though quieter now, still throbbed beneath her skin. It was there, a constant reminder of the curse of the darkness. But it was no longer a threat. It was part of her, and for the first time since the witch's curse had entered her life, she felt in control. The figure, whatever it was gone, dispersed, vanquished by the very force it had tried to manipulate. Isla wiped her forehead, the weight of the moment sinking in. She wasn't free from the darkness. It would always be a part of her, but she had learned something powerful. She could control it. Her heart still beat strong, the pulse inside her steady, like the rhythm of a drum. She had conquered her fear, her doubt. She had accepted the curse, and in doing so, she had found her strength. The world around her was quiet again, the shadows retreating into the woods, leaving her in a fragile peace. But this peace was different. Isla was different. The battle had only just begun, but she knew now. She would fight it on her terms. Isla stood still in the clearing, the last remnants of light from the battle fading around her like a dissipating storm. Her pulse still throbbed in her chest, a reminder of the darkness that had taken root inside her. But now, she was no longer afraid of it. For the first time, she felt an eerie calm. The curse, once an insurmountable weight, was now just another part of her, like a shadow at her side. It didn't control her, she controlled it. The wind stirred the branches overhead, the forest around her still as death. For a moment, she wondered if she had truly won. Was the fight over? Or was this merely a brief reprieve? But then she felt it again, the presence. The pulse inside her flared, a low hum that thrummed through her veins, steady and unyielding. It was calling to her, and for the briefest of moments, Isla was unsure whether she should resist or listen. The world around her, began to warp again. The trees seemed to stretch, their trunks twisting and bending unnaturally. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The pulse had awoken something. A new force. A presence far older and darker than the witch, than anything she had ever known. Her heart pounded, but this time there was no fear. She understood now. The curse was not just an evil force. It was an ancient primal power, a force of nature, one that had been forgotten by time, buried in the shadows of history. Isla raised her hand, the power within her thrumming against her skin. "You are not free," a voice whispered from the shadows. It wasn't the figure she had faced before. This voice was different, more ancient, more primal, and Isla knew, deep down, that it wasn't speaking to her as a threat. It was speaking to her as a warning. The earth trembled again, more violently this time. But Isla didn't move. She stood firm, her eyes narrowing as the presence grew stronger, pressing in from all sides. She had embraced the darkness within her, but now the true test was before her. Would she be its master, or would she become another lost soul, swallowed whole by its hunger? The pulse surged, louder now, filling her ears with a deafening roar. And Isla took a step forward. That Isla's hand trembled as she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the shifting shadows around her. The forest was no longer just a place. It had become a living thing, pulsing with the same dark energy that thrummed beneath her skin. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the curse and the ancient force it had awoken. But Isla was no longer afraid. She had learned to embrace the darkness inside her, to make it her own. She was no longer just a victim, nor was she a vessel for something else's will. She was the power. The presence that had surrounded her seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if unsure of what to make of her. But Isla, steady and resolute, stood her ground. The ancient voice whispered again, this time softer, almost reverent. "You've chosen then," it said. "You've chosen the path of the eternal." Isla nodded. She had chosen to become the balance between light and shadow, the keeper of both, rather than be consumed by either. She had learned that the curse was not just a curse. It was part of a greater, timeless force that existed in every living thing. She would not be its puppet. She would be its guardian. The forest around her seemed to breathe in rhythm with her heartbeat. The trees swayed gently, their leaves rustling like whispered secrets. The shadows pulled back, acknowledging her newfound command. The dark energy that had once threatened to consume her was now a quiet hum in the background, a constant, but manageable force that no longer ruled her. Isla's eyes flickered to the horizon, where the first rays of the sun began to break through the canopy. The light that had once seemed so distant, so fragile, now felt like a natural extension of her own power. The curse had given her the ability to tap into both the light and the dark, and now she would wield them together. With one last breath, Isla closed her eyes and let the energy inside her settle, knowing the battle was far from over. But she was ready. The forest, the shadows, and the curse would not defeat her. She was the keeper of both realms now, and she would protect the fragile balance between them. As the sun broke through the trees and bathed her in its warmth, Isla took one final step forward. The forest embraced her, the light and the shadows intertwining in perfect harmony as she walked into the future unafraid.